Welcome, friends. This is Economic Update, a weekly program examining the economic dimensions of our lives: jobs, incomes, debts, futures, all of that. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. I've had the pleasure of preparing and bringing this program to you since March of 2011. We started at WBAI in New York, and I'm proud to say we are now broadcast weekly on over 35 stations in the United States, Canada, and beyond. We go out to a large number of people, and I am grateful for the interest and for the many, many communications we get that help us shape this program. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. I've been a professor of economics all my adult life. I currently teach at the New School University in New York City, and I also write columns for the remarkable independent source of news and analysis called Truthout. Please check them out at truthout.org. We also maintain two websites that I invite you to look at. They're available free of charge 24/7. They are remarkable if you're interested in this kind of analysis, the sources, the extension of these ideas, lectures, whole classes, all of that we put and publish on both of these websites, I might say. The first is R.D. Wolff, with two F's, W-O-L-F-F, rdwolff.com, and the second one is democracyatwork.info. Both of them provide you with all of this extra material, and both of you give you an opportunity to communicate to us your thoughts, questions, criticisms of the program. I guarantee you we read each and every one of them and use them to shape this program, and towards the end of each program we answer one or two selected questions. Please have patience with us. We could not possibly answer all the questions we get. We select those that we think will be the interesting topic for many of you. And finally, both websites allow you, with the click of a button, to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest, and keep even closer contact with all that we do. I want to begin today's updates with two very short items that came to me at the last minute. You might think one of them is a tragedy and the other one is a victory of sorts, and I wanted to bring them to your attention. I'm going to begin with the tragedy. I want to thank Ryan, who sent this in. It's a story that is based in our presentation on an article that was written by Tom Hayden, Haydon, that appeared on August 26th in the New Jersey newspaper in Newark, the Star-Ledger. It's about a woman, a 32-year-old woman named Maria Fernandez. She apparently had lost a full-time job, if she indeed ever had one, and she was working 4 jobs the other night, which is typical for her, including 2 shifts at different Dunkin' Donuts shops in the area where she lives, Elizabeth, New Jersey. And then one night last week, she drove home and did what she often did, stopping for a couple of hours to catch a few winks to get the sleep she needs as she shuttled around among her 4 jobs. She also kept in her car a can of gasoline. Her car was a 2001 Kia Sportage. That's all she could afford. And she kept the gasoline to avoid running out of gas as she shuttled back and forth among her 4 jobs. She went to sleep at the corner of Routes 1 and 9 in Elizabeth for a nap like that the other day. Apparently, she left the car motor running, and the gasoline in the back of her car spilled, and she died in her car. Maria Fernandez, working 4 jobs. In the story in the Star-Ledger, the reporter wisely went and spoke with Carl Van Horn, director of the John Heldrich Center for Workforce Development at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, and Rutgers is the state university of New Jersey. And here's what Carl Van Horn told the reporter. These are folks who would like to work full-time, but they can't find the jobs. They wind up in these circumstances in which they are exhausted. More commonly, it creates just an enormous amount of stress. He said that there are tens of thousands of people in New Jersey holding these multiple jobs. And he said further that the situation is that the average person who once had a full-time job, lost it in this crisis, and now has multiple jobs, took a 10% or more pay cut even with the 4 jobs compared to what they had before. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics in Washington, 7.5 million people nationwide have more than 1 job. The death of Maria Fernandez is one of the many costs of an economic system that no longer serves most of us, although not yet in the disastrous failure represented by the death of this young, hard-working woman. My second quick story is a good news story, perhaps to balance off what the other one conveyed. This has to do with a story we've been following for a while, has to do with a chain of supermarkets, mostly in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and some in Maine, called Market Basket. For those of you that may recall, it was an interesting story because this is a multi-million-dollar big business, but still owned by the original Demoulas family. But his family is split into 2 factions. One faction basically wanted to take the profits and make themselves rich, and the other faction, led by 2 different members of the same family, these 2 factions, was more interested in providing profit sharing to workers, supporting and building in the communities that were being served by this company. And the latter faction had been in charge, but then was defeated by a shift of a member of the family who voted for the other faction. And so starting some months ago, the company was being taken over by a faction that, as I said, wanted to use the profits basically for themselves. And then something very interesting happened. The workers decided they weren't going to simply let a family fight among the owners, a handful of people after all, determine the life experience, the economic well-being, not only of the thousands of employees of this company, but of all the communities served by this company. And so the workers began to protest, to show that they wanted it to go back to Arthur T. rather than Arthur S. Demoulas to be in charge, the faction that supported the workers in the communities. And they appealed to local politicians, all the way up to the governors of Massachusetts and New Hampshire, and they all weighed in. And they all said the same thing. We want a company that serves the community and not simply gets rich off of it. And I have good news. The pressure of the politicians, but above all of the workers who made the decision not to accept what the owners and managers of their company wanted to dictate to them. They fought back. And between them and the political support they could get, basically the politicians supported it because the workers had gotten the communities active. It's a lesson, isn't it, about what can be done. It's a lesson of the power of working people. They won. The faction that supports working people is back in charge. And that was agreed to because why? Because with the support of the workers and the communities, a boycott of this store had been begun. And they were losing millions of dollars a week as people found other places to shop to show their solidarity with this demand on the company. And the company caved in to these demands of the workers. The majority, the communities, the workers, defeated the minority. That's what happened here, and that's why it's on this program, and that's why I celebrate it. A word of caution, as when I talked about this last time. You do have to be careful, folks, because what we're doing here is we're seeing workers choosing between 2 corporate leaders. Favorable, friendly one versus a self-serving one. The problem is, the long-term problem, do workers really want to be in a position of picking who is the lesser evil of 2 leaderships that are privately owned family corporations? And the same would apply to a regular corporation. Might it not be the better strategy in the long run for workers to say they themselves ought to own and operate these companies, because then they would work out among themselves how this company works, not be in the dangerous position, even if you have the preferred family member, that what happened before a vote changes can happen again. You're very precarious in your victory if you don't take it the next step and make this a worker co-op, which would be the best for the workers, all things considered. Let me turn now to the updates for this time. Much of the last week has seen headlines about the Burger King Corporation, a leading chain of hamburger joints here in the United States and indeed in a number of other countries. Here's what happened, and let's take a look at what it means. Burger King announced that it was going to merge with a Canadian chain of restaurants called Tim Hortons, well known across Canada, the way Burger King is well known in the United States. This is a merger of two similarly focused companies. It is driven, as all mergers are, by many considerations: the profit that can be gleaned, the costs that can be saved, the taxes that can be reduced. But in this one, that last one, that taxes that can be reduced, seem to loom large. This is going to be then another one of the things we've talked about on this program called inversions. And to remind everyone, this is when a company, in this case Burger King, an American company, buys a company in another country, in this case Tim Hortons in Canada, and that the Tim Hortons company is bought with a number of shares, which means that the number of Canadians owning shares in Burger King will cross 20%, and that allows Burger King to declare to the American government that it is now a Canadian corporation, and so it pays Canadian income tax rates rather than American. And Canadian income tax rates being lower than the American, there are tax savings that Burger King will enjoy. This has gotten all kinds of American politicians bent out of shape. It's a little strange because some of them have said they're not comfortable with Burger King being not an American company. Well, that's strange. Why? Because some years ago, the Brazilian billionaire Jorge Paulo Lemann by name, who owns a company called 3G Capital, already bought a controlling share of Burger King. In terms of ownership, Burger King is already not an American company, at least not in the way most Americans think of that. And it's Mr. Jorge Paulo Lemann who has cut a deal with none other than Warren Buffett of Omaha, Nebraska, who's providing a huge $1 billion worth of money to help make this transaction happen. Mr. Lemann and Mr. Buffett are already partners. They bought the H.J. Heinz ketchup company last year for over $23 billion. This is a smaller deal for them, but it is simply part of what is happening around the world. Big companies getting bigger, making a lot of money, saving on wage costs to workers, and saving on taxes to the communities which they are quote-unquote serving. President Obama has said this is not a good idea. Mr. Boehner and Mr. Camp, the Republicans in the House, have said, not a good idea. Back in the 1980s, something was done to stop it, but the companies got around it. Then in 2004, another something was done to slow this process down, but the companies, like Burger King, are getting around it. That's the usual story. The regulations either don't get passed, or they get passed and evaded, or they get passed, evaded, and then repealed. Regulating economy of ours, the way we've done, does not work, has not worked, and will not solve our problems now. Another update. There's again a shuffle of the government in France, and I wanted to talk briefly about it. Why? This time it's a split among two socialists. The governing Socialist Party seems to be splitting. Whether it takes a formal step to split or not, we will see in the weeks and months ahead. But the president, François Hollande, has apparently decided to shuffle his cabinet as a way of dismissing Arnaud Montebourg, his economics minister, his industrial minister, in his cabinet. Why? Mr. Hollande, who was a big campaigner that he did not like austerity, this program of cutting wages, cutting government programs to please the bondholders, those who demand that France spend less on its people so that it can spend more paying interest to the bondholders, who turn out to be the big banks, who turn out to be those who brought us the crisis that they're now using as a way to get governments to do what they want. An amazing story which we tell on this program often. But Mr. Hollande changed his mind and is now in favor of a mild kind of austerity, not as bad as it could be. And it turns out that what in his mind the word socialism means is we do what the capitalists want, but we don't do it as harshly and as heavily as they would like. This wasn't enough for Mr. Montebourg. And he began speaking critically that they shouldn't have any austerity. They should switch to a Keynesian economic program, stimulate the economy, and France's economy is stumbling, so it needs help, stimulate it, but not by cutting government services, not by pressing wages down, not by making the conditions of workers harder, which is what austerity, even the mild kind of Mr. Hollande wants. No, Mr. Montebourg says stimulate the economy from below. Hire more people, tax the rich, spend a little. You know, that daring sort of socialist thing that Franklin Roosevelt did in the United States, but with much more gusto. And the French socialists are splitting over it. Let's be clear. Once upon a time, socialist meant you were not supportive of capitalism. You wanted a change of the system. You wanted workers to own the means of production. You wanted the government, in the interest of everybody, to plan what happens rather than let the market decide, since the market always favors those who have the most to spend in it. That's all gone. Most socialists, not all, but most socialists have gone the way of Hollande and Montebourg, arguing over more or less austerity, arguing over more or less government help for people. But changing the basic system, no. And because they don't talk about it or deal with it, they can't face what the real problem is that plagues the French economy. And that problem is the same one that plagues the American economy. Companies leaving, going elsewhere where they can pay a fraction of the wages, and abandoning the countries in which these companies were born, the countries that subsidized, gave them tax breaks, helped them at every step of the way. Now, when they can make more money going somewhere else, it's another version of the old hasta la vista, baby. But there's a special twist here in the story about France. It reminded me of a story we did way back when, last year in 2003, having to do with a particular company, an American company, Titan International, which produces rubber automobile tires. Their chairman, Maurice Taylor, became famous at the beginning of 2013 because he is in charge of the Goodyear tire and rubber factory, The Titan was going to take over, the Goodyear rubber and tire factory in a French city. But when he saw what the conditions of workers are, what their protections are, he said, I'm not going to go through with this. I'm not going to take over the Goodyear tire and rubber under the name of Titan now. I'm not going to do that because French workers don't really work. French workers are lazy. French workers get too much money, and so I'm leaving. And he left with this remark, and I'm quoting to you from the original story in Bloomberg Business Week. Quote from Mr. Maurice Taylor, Jr., head of Titan International. Titan is going to buy a Chinese tire company or an Indian one. We will pay less than €1 per hour wage. That'd be about $1.50, a little less than $1.50. And then we'll ship all the tires France needs. You can keep the so-called workers. Tough guy Maurice Taylor, he's telling the French off, and he's saying what he's going to do. It's worth listening to him because what he's going to do is what companies are everywhere either doing or threatening to do. It's not worth listening to him because, frankly, he's ignorant. And let me tell you why. First, the French wage, after the taxes they pay, is 1/3 lower than the wage in the United States. Number two, French workers' productivity, the amount of output per worker employed, is among the highest in the world. It's higher than labor productivity in the United States. It's even higher than labor productivity in Germany. Unions are not the problem he suggests either. Union membership is significantly lower than Germany, a place that these kinds of folks always celebrate. So the problem is companies leaving or threatening to leave, the way Goodyear did and the way now Titan is doing. That's the issue. And socialists who deserve the name would be working on that issue big time, rather than debating more or less austerity. Another update. We're going to do a bit more in the way of updates because there's so many this week. This one is particularly interesting and raises a bigger question anyway, so this part of the program, which normally deals with larger issues, we're still doing that in a way. This is a story that I take from the New York Times, which had a very interesting piece by Anna Bernasek on the 23rd of August of this year. And what this New York Times article does is ask and answer a question. Why, says the New York Times, is the cost of a cell phone so much higher in the United States than in most other countries, with particular reference in this story to Great Britain, a country close to us, similar to us in so many ways. And so what the New York Times did is to compare the costs of a plan that uses the same phone, an iPhone 5S as in Stephen, with 16 gigabytes of memory. Both the British plan and the American plan do that. Both require a 2-year commitment and allow unlimited voice minutes and unlimited texting. In Britain, it also offers us unlimited data and requires no upfront payment. Including Britain's 20% tax, the plan costs, ready, about $68 a month. Now let's compare the closest similar plan provided by the American carrier Verizon Wireless. When all the adjustments are made for the similar program, so forth, it costs, ready, $109.50 roughly. $109.50 for the American plan, same plan in England, $68. We're not talking even close. Why does this difference exist? Why are phone companies in the United States able to rip off their customers compared to the British? And by the way, the British companies are very profitable at that much lower price. What's going on? The answer the New York Times comes up with is simple. Here we go. I'm going to read it to you right from the article so you have it from the proverbial horse's mouth. The important one is this. Britain has forced companies to lease their networks to competitors at cost. The United States has not done that, allowing a formidable barrier against competitors. Okay, let's unpack this quickly. What's going on? The leaders of big corporations in America love to give speeches about the wonders and benefits of competition. Typically, they do this while doing everything in their power to eliminate competition in their own business. They're constantly looking for ways that they can do that. Later in the program, I'll be telling you about how advertising helps them do that. But in this case, they went to the government and helped write the laws that allow big network owners like Verizon to force competitors who might want to provide cell service not to be able to get access to their systems at cost. The British require it because the companies there weren't powerful enough to prevent it, but the American companies were. They got the uncompetitive arrangement imposed, and it's making a fortune for them at the expense of everybody who uses a cell phone. In our society, companies look to overcome competition to make more money. And the only thing that really prevents that from getting worse and worse and worse is that other companies sometimes jump in to force open an uncompetitive market because they have the big bucks enabling them to do it. Little companies rarely can. So we have an outcome where we all live with how much competition there is or isn't, depending on what big company is more or less successful in getting a uncompetitive situation like Verizon, and what other big company may be making it hard for them to do that. It's a serious reality. We are constantly affected by non-competitive situations, and all the rules and all the regulations and all the so-called controls haven't prevented this process from continuing, as this story about uncompetitive cell phone extortions in this country attest. We're now going to take our short break. Please stay with us. We have many more updates and analyses to offer to you.
When some people struggle with their mortgage payments, they become frozen. But the people who take action are far more likely to get the most positive outcome. Call this free government program for the option that's right for you.
Welcome back to Economic Update. This is Richard Wolff, your host. I want to remind you again that we have two websites that we maintain continuously and at no charge for you to use to follow up on these stories and to gain all kinds of other materials that we make available to you, and we update these websites every day. The first one is rdwolf with 2s.com, and the other one is Democracy at Work, all one word, democracyatwork.info, I-N-F-O. In addition, you can use those websites to communicate your thoughts, criticisms, and questions to us, and you can also click on the appropriate icon to become a follower of ours on Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest. Continuing our updates, another story in the news over the last week or two, Bank of America hit with the largest fine to date for all of the inappropriate, unethical, and illegal activities in which they engaged, and they have agreed to pay $16.7 billion, the largest such fine in effect to date. But before you weep for Bank of America, keep in mind the following little facts about this big fine. Number one, you can imagine, or maybe you can't, how much money these people played with and acquired inappropriately if that's the size fine they have to pay, to which they agreed. But before I go through the shenanigans that are wrapped up here, let me just point out that the stock of Bank America on the stock exchange, on the day this fine was announced, did the shareholders say, oh my gosh, such an enormous amount of money is really a punishment for the bank is going to be less profitable, the bank is not going to grow so quickly, it's time for me to get out of owning shares of stock? No. Stock surged upward over 4% on that very day. That's what the shareholders understood. This was a fine that wasn't making Bank America less profitable as a monster bank. Quite the contrary. Well, here we go. Many of the provisions do not have to be enacted upon by the bank until as late as 2018. We're not going to rush the bank, are we? So this fine is stretched out over many years, so it has less and less impact on the profits generated in any one year. Number two, a good part of what they will actually have to pay will be tax-deductible outlays. Let me be clear with you. They're going to pay the government X billion out of this 16.7, but a certain X billion they can deduct, reducing their taxes to the government by billions. That's right. they don't really pay 16.7 because part of that will be recouped by the reduction in the taxes they have to pay. Is it amazing? That's not at all unusual. Number three, they've sold a lot of the, let's call them questionable mortgages they wrote to others. But they're allowed to count if those others, the company they sold the questionable mortgages to, work out a deal with the homeowner to lower the total amount he or she owes this other company. Bank of America is allowed to count that as part of what it has offered to pay. Other people will make a deal, they get the credit in terms of this. It's extraordinary. It doesn't change anything in the basic banking structure. It lets companies know that if you're really gross for a long time, you will get a slap on the wrist. Other than that, no lessons here have been learned. As I promised last time, when we had only a short amount of time to talk about advertising, I was going to come back and spend a little time with you to get that topic dealt with. And so I'm going to do it. Again, I want to remind you, we're talking about an enormous industry, which according to Consumer Reports in their issue of June 2014, in the last year for which they have numbers, 2012, advertising involved total expenditures by people who buy advertising, $161.2 billion, an immense industry. So let's go. Why do companies buy advertising? The answer is very simple. They either want to sell more goods than they otherwise could, and by hustling, by telling you wonderful things about whatever it is they produce, they can sell more of them. Or they advertise in the hopes that by creating and stimulating desire and demand for what they have to sell, they'll be able to charge a higher price. So either they want to sell more, or they want to sell whatever they have at a higher price, or more likely, both of those. Sell more and jack up the price. And in order to do that, given where the public's mind is, they think to themselves, wow, maybe I can come up with some way to convince people to want more of what I produce, so much want that they'll pay more for it. Now, if what advertising was, which some of their folks claim, I kid you not, that they're simply informing the public about what they produce, then of course they would have to tell you about its strengths and its weaknesses, its advantages and its disadvantages. You will wait a long time before paid advertising does anything of the sort. Paid advertising is the definition of one-sided description. They tell you only about the positive. Indeed, you're lucky if the positive things they say are true, but they do not tell you about the negative. They leave that out. Why? Well, you know why. Because the goal is to sell more of what they produce and to jack up a higher price. And the minute one producer in an industry does it, all the others have to. Because if the one is successful in pulling customers away from the other by hawking what he or she sells, by making advertising about it, it forces all the others to, which for the ad industry is wonderful. Now everybody has to advertise, not indeed to get more customers, not indeed to raise the price, but in order to avoid losing customers to the ones who do advertise. And this leads to some really stunning examples that I'm going to leave you with. First, something as mundane as aspirin or bufferin or any one of the aspirin-type medications, over-the-counter ibuprofen, acetaminophen, and so on. I won't go through the names, you all know them. Here's what we know. The actual cost of producing these little pain relief pills is trivial. But the price you pay isn't. It's significant. But here comes the message and the lesson. A large part of the price you pay is actually reimbursing the company for the advertising costs it had to get you to buy it. So you may be buying $2 worth of aspirin that cost 20 cents to make, 20 cents to make it, maybe another $1 to advertise it, so 20 cents to make it, $1 to advertise it, so a total cost of $1.20, and they sell it to you for $2. And this is not a far-fetched example at all, and there are many, many, many such examples. What do they mean? They mean that often when you pay a price for something, you're not paying what it costs. You're actually paying the costs of getting you to want it. The ultimate burden of paying for advertising is on all of us as consumers. The joke, if that's the right word, is on us. Advertising is a colossal misuse of resources, of skills, of artistic talents, devoted to getting us to pay more than we should for the goods and services we need, to buy more than we would otherwise have done. Should we be spending $162 billion a year to hustle our own products to ourselves at a higher cost than we would otherwise pay? The irrationality of this and the mockery it makes of the idea we live in an economy where people produce what the people want. No, no, no. Long ago, the big capitalists understood. We want to produce what's profitable. We'll make the people want it because that's what we do. And if I had more time, I'd talk about what it does to our culture, by the way. To have advertisers use every trick in the book, to play on every psychological weakness. Here, buy this soap because it'll improve your sex life. Here, buy this clothing because you won't be so lonely if maybe you do. Here, use this perfume because you don't smell real good, etc., etc. No blow too low. It's extraordinary what advertising is. It's a sign of what capitalism has been and is. Next story that we have time for, and this is an important one. Many of you have sent me in questions. You pick up on what I say periodically to the effect that we don't have an economic recovery. What we have, in fact, is something much, much less than that. And you keep asking me, so I thought what I would do is pull together 3 statistics to demonstrate, to prove that we're not in a recovery in this economy. So allow me to do the numbers. There won't be very many, and I've condensed them down to 3 that I think make the point as clearly as I know how. First, and all of these, by the way, are taken from the New York Times. I did that deliberately so I could give you dates. Those of you that want to do the research can go back and read the greater detail on these topics. First, a story in the New York Times on the 22nd of August, 2014. The median household income in the United States. What does that mean? 50% of Americans earned more than this. 50% of American households earned more, and 50% earned less of the number I'm about to give you. In the year 2000, the median household income, with all of these numbers adjusted so it's in the same terms of the same year's prices. What that means is I'm going to give you a measure of the goods and services you could afford to buy with this amount of money. In economics terms, I'm using 2014 dollars, what the dollars were worth, so we're really measuring what you can afford to buy. In the year 2000, the median level income in the United States of households, $57,000. So 50% had more than that, 50% had less. In 2014, the number is $53,800. In other words, more than a 10% drop in the median income, what you can actually afford to buy for the bottom 50% of the people. That means it dropped for not just the bottom 50%, but at least another 20 or 25% above that. 3/4 of our people have seen a drop in their family income over the 14 years of this new century. What recovery? That's not a recovery, that's a decline. And by the way, it's the decline from 2006, the last year before this crisis. So we haven't recovered from the crisis, and we haven't recovered compared to where we were in the year 2000, 14 years ago. So that's what happened to our income. Let me turn next again to the New York Times and ask what happened to the real wealth, the value in dollars of the wealth of an American household. Your car, your home, etc. All that, minus your debts. And here I'm using a story, also from the New York Times, from July 26 of this year. Okay? Median household wealth. 50% had more, 50% had less. So let's see. That story compares 2003, the beginning of this century, and 2013, last year. And what do we see? The net worth, the median net worth of an American household, 50% had less, 50% had more than this, was $88,000 in 2003. And where did it go in 2013? You ready? To 56. That's right. A drop from 88,000 to 56,000 in those 10 years. That's not a recovery. That's an unmitigated decline of enormous proportions. So the median income of Americans has been declining for the last 14 years and has not recovered. And the median wealth of the American households have declined even more. Simple conclusion, the majority of Americans are worse off than they were in 2006, and they're worse off than they were 15 years ago when we went from the 20th to the 21st century. Third statistic to drive the point home. A recent story in the New York Times, I believe the date was August 28th, talked about the housing industry and something very interesting in the statistics. Compared to the last year before the crisis, 2006, 2005 and 2006, the number of single-family homes being built in the United States is down, get ready for this, 60%, 60. It's down 60%. The number of housing structures that accommodate between 2 and 4 families, small units, is down almost as much. But what has recovered, the only part of the housing industry that has recovered to what it was in 2006, not much above it, we're not booming, we've just gotten back to where we were, was apartment houses with more than 4 units in them. What is this telling us? It's telling us that the American working people can't afford single-family homes anymore. They're having to switch to what they can afford, which is a rental apartment. Why is that? Because their incomes have been dropping and because their wealth has been dropping. With a lower income, you don't qualify for a mortgage. With less wealth, you can't make the down payment. Of course, the middle class, whatever exactly that means, is disappearing. We have an economic system that is delivering no recovery, decline, and transformation of life conditions to the majority of the American people. The only really interesting question is, how long will the majority tolerate and support an economic system that works that way? It's not in their interest, is it? In the remaining 10 minutes or so that we have, I want to respond to some of your questions. You've been sending me quite a few. They are excellent. And again, my apologies before I leap into it that we can't answer more of them. Please continue to send them, because even if we don't select your question to answer, we do factor your interest in shaping what we do cover on the program. Okay, the first question is about a state in the United States, Michigan in particular, and I want to talk about that, but I picked it because it's of great interest across the country. Michigan is a place where trade unions have been and still are very strong. The level of unionization in Michigan is quite a bit higher than that in the United States, almost twice as high. But a law was passed recently in Michigan under the pressure of the Koch brothers and others to allow union members, particularly public employees, to quit the union if they wish, and also to stop paying dues if they wish, even when they aren't members of the union. And in order to explain that, I want to make 2 points. One, August 2014 is a period, a window of a month when teachers, public school teachers in Michigan, have the opportunity to quit the union or to quit paying dues, even if they're not union members, to the teachers' union in that state. And there's a lot of campaigning going on urging them to do that. And the campaigning says something like, you should be free, to the worker, the teacher, not to pay dues. You should be free not to join the union. And so somehow this is an expression of your freedom to get out of paying. Let's explain this. There is a law in the United States that governs all unionized workplaces. And here's what the law says. Anything and everything that a union can win for its members, whether that be higher wages, whether that be a medical insurance benefit, whether that be a pension benefit, whether that be a personal day off to deal with family issues, whatever a union wins, here comes the key point, must be given to all the workers at a workplace. In particular, whether the worker, the individual worker, is a member of the union or not, and whether the worker pays dues to the union or not, the worker will get whatever the union wins. So, for example, if there is a disagreement between the workers' union on the one hand and the employer on the other, and if they can't resolve their differences, and if a strike happens where the workers say, we're not going to continue working unless you meet us halfway or something to that effect, the union calls on all workers to go out on strike. It can't force them to do it. It has no such power. But typically, the union members will heed the leadership. They, after all, have the right to vote whether or not a strike is called. They're not simply taking what their leaders say. They have to have the right to vote. That's in the law, too. So the workers vote. Typically, they go out on strike. They may be on strike a week or 2 or 6 or 9. During that time, they don't get paid. If they're lucky, their union gives them a strike pay, which is almost always much less than they would have earned if they had kept working. So those workers are paying with their own losses for the pressure they put on the employer to meet them. And let's suppose after a few weeks, the employer and the employees reach finally an agreement. The workers may have wanted 6% increase wages, but they only got 3, let's say. Now, here comes the law. The 3% increase won by the workers who went out on strike, losing hundreds or thousands of dollars in pay. That was the sacrifice they made to win something better. That something better must be given to all the employees there, whether or not they're members of the union, whether or not they pay union dues. Imposing this law was a tremendous damage done to the union movement in this country, because basically it invites workers to become free riders, to say, oh, I'm happy there's a union here, but I'm not going to join it, and therefore I don't have to pay union dues. I still get all the benefits of a union, but I don't have to pay my fair share. I've pushed that onto union members. In response to that, the unions developed something called agency fee. They said, all right, if workers don't want to join the union, they don't have to. That's their freedom of choice. We won't require it. But it seems minimally fair to us as unions that if the law requires everything the union gets to be given to every worker, he or she doesn't have to join the union, but they have to help pay for the costs of the union, which is the way workers get improved wages and job conditions. Because if we can't do that, the union hasn't got the money to run, then the workers are worse off, and then they won't get the improvements that unions have gotten for workers across the history of the United States. What the Koch brothers did and what the Michigan law does is basically say to teachers, you don't have to be in the union and you don't have to pay any dues. You still get anything the union wins, but you don't have to pay anything. It's an appeal to the least team spirit you can imagine. A year ago was the last time teachers had that opportunity. 1% of them chose to take it. My hat's off. But this year the campaign is harder, an attempt made to get more of them. And if a large number do, they will, of course, cripple the union, and it will be unable to get anything for them or for the remaining members. This is an attempt to break and destroy unions, and everyone in America ought to pay attention, because whether or not it works in Michigan will have a lot to do with whether it comes to visit you where you live. One of you asked me, is it indeed true, in your email you asked, is it indeed true that American colleges and universities have changed their rules, particularly the private ones and particularly the elite expensive ones, to really bring lower income people in, to give lower income Americans a chance at the education which, now more than ever, seems to be a ticket to get good jobs and to live at a decent level of income? So I did the research, again with the benefit of, because I want to give credit where credit is due, to the New York Times and to a reporter from whom I have learned much over the years, a man named Richard Perez Pena, a reporter for the New York Times. And in a story on the 25th of August, he answers this question very definitively with the following one word: no. That is, the elite schools of this country, the rich schools, the big schools, the private schools, the expensive schools, have not done that. Indeed, early in his story, he quotes Anthony Carnevale, who's the director of Georgetown University's Center on Education and the Workforce. I can't say it any better than Mr. Carnevale, so I'll quote him from this article. Quote, "Higher education has become a powerful force for reinforcing advantage and passing it on through generations." Well, that doesn't leave much for me to say. So let me just give you the statistics as reported in that article by Mr. Richard Perez Pena. Okay? In 2006, at the 82 schools rated most competitive by Barron's Profiles of American Colleges, so in the 82 most prestigious, most competitive schools in the United States, here we go, the poorer half of America provided 14% of the students. The richer half of America provided 86% of the students. Are we clear? The majority of Americans, the vast majority, are providing at best a fifth of the students. You're not doing anything like offsetting inequality. At another study reported in this article, between 2001 and 2009, a period of major increases in financial aid that was ballyhooed all over the place as really being a breakthrough. Students from the bottom 40% of families went from 10% to 11%. No significant change at all. Finally, in the little bit of time we have left, one of you asked the question, what does it mean when corporations announce a stock buyback? Let me briefly explain. There may be tens or hundreds or thousands or even millions of employees in a company. They all help to produce the profits, but the profits are taken by the board of directors, a tiny minority, often of people who do not work in the company at all, usually 15 to 20 people, and one of the powers of the board of directors, a stunning power, is to decide what to do with the profits. And one of the things the board of directors can do is use the profits not to expand the company, not to improve the technology, not to provide benefits for workers, but instead to go into the stock market and use the profits of the company to buy shares in the company from whoever holds them. What this does is drive up the price of the shares. That's wonderful for shareholders who like to see the value of their company go up, and it's great for the top executives because the bonuses they get are often tied to the price of the shares. So they can use the profits they control to jack up the price of the shares, thereby giving themselves big bonuses. If we had worker cooperatives instead of corporations, if the workers themselves decided what to do with the profits, they could not and they would not do anything like that. We're seeing capitalism take care of its own, and its own is a tiny minority and not the rest of us. That's the fundamental problem of this system, and why the corporate organization form is something we have to challenge and question and change. This is Richard Wolff. We've come to the end of our program. I want to thank you very much for being with me, and I look forward to seeing you and visiting with you next week on Economic Update.